This is Evidence Not Seen, the biography of Darlene Deibler Rose. And we started reading it, and she is in the island of Papua New Guinea during World War II. In early December, Walter Post and Russell left by inter-island steamer for Ambon, the seat of the government controlling the Spice Islands. Here they purchased additional trail boots from the field police canteen, a minimum of camping equipment, as well as trail food for themselves and their carriers. The governor was most helpful and arranged for them to travel by government steamer to the village of Oeda on New Guinea's south coast. They arrived safely and unloaded the supplies. Then Walter Post returned to Ambon. The day after Christmas, the Ambonese government official took Russell, his 10 native carriers, and supplies in the government launch upstream with a canoe in tow to the first series of rapids. From this point, the supplies and canoe had to be portaged around the rapids. They reached the base camp in late afternoon of the third day. This I learned from a letter forwarded to me through the kindness of the government official. Remembering what I had read of the trail, I commended Russell and the carriers continually to the Lord for strength and safety, courage and endurance. With the other missionaries, I prayed that God would overshadow him, enabling him to reach the Whistle Lakes speedily and safely. How very much he suffered, how imperative our intercession, I was not to know for many weeks to come. While Russell was gone, Margaret Kemp pressed me, encouraged me to attempt more than I and myself thought possible. Translating weekly Sunday school lessons for the junior department and supervising several teachers, after only a few months of language study, were her idea. I was regularly scheduled to speak in chapel, and the wives of the national workers asked if I would assist them with kindergarten for the children of the teachers and students. It was a valuable experience. I continued furthering my study of the language with a government school teacher from Minando. His excellence in Indonesian inspired me to strive for mastery in the language. Anyone can babble along in Pasar, market, Malay, after a few weeks' study, but proper Indonesian is beautiful, without harsh gutturals. To hear the language well spoken is like listening to a symphony played upon the instrument of words, like enjoying a Renier painting with a brush of fluency, a masterpiece of lights and shadows. At the beginning of the new school year, I was handed a church history book in English and asked if I would accept it as one of the subjects I would be teaching second-year students. I accepted it readily, but after perusing the first few chapters, I began to think I had more enthusiasm than good sense. How do you present church history to students who, fresh from the jungle, have seen their own coastline, the ocean, and an outside world for the first time within the past year? It was quite an assignment, which proved not only a challenge, but an inspiration. Most of those in my first-year classes were Dayaks from Borneo. Since all classes were in Indonesian, they had to acquire working knowledge of a language foreign to them. Many of them had never held a pencil before. Besides their language classes, they were taught reading, writing, arithmetic, music, scripture memorization, and stories of the Old and New Testaments. Being confined to the classroom was in itself a great trial to them. They had been a free people living on the periphery of civilization. Never had they been subjected to a schedule. I loved and admired them as they sat bowed over their books, foreheads creased with frowns from the extreme heat and intense concentration. Trickles of perspiration coursed down their cheeks. I found fulfillment, joy, and tremendous satisfaction in all my responsibilities. This was one of God's priceless gifts to me, to have had to learn to assume responsibilities from the time I was small. I never had a time to be bored. I wouldn't have chosen the separation from Russell, but the Lord had promised me when I responded to the missionary calling, "Go, I am with you always." The presence of God and His people kept my heart at peace. In February, word came that Russell would be arriving from Manokwari. My excitement was without bounds. But why Manokwari, a village on the north coast of New Guinea? When the steamer eased into port at Makassar, I was nearly bursting with excitement. Positioned at the front of those gathered to greet disembarking passengers, I was totally dismayed when I saw a gaunt, wasted stranger with Walter Post. The other missionaries recognized the slimmed-down Russell as the man they knew before his furlough. But where was the man I had married? The husband who had left for New Guinea? In just 18 days on the trail and a few months of meager rations, he had lost more than 60 pounds. Darlene? When I heard his voice, I knew it was Russell, but the voice shouldn't belong to this emaciated stranger. I quickly looked down, not wanting him to see my uneasiness. My shyness amused him, but the shock I felt, thinking of what he must have suffered, was with me for days. He walked with considerable pain, and once back at the house, when he removed his shoes and socks, I knew why. There was no skin on his insteps, the balls of his feet, or any of his toes. He had a serious advanced case of jungle rot. Dr. Jaffrey immediately sent for a doctor, who came to the house to examine Russell's feet. Turning to me, he said, "Do you see this tissue that is sloughing off? Each morning, take a tweezer and tear off every layer until you reach the raw, throbbing flesh. Don't apply the ointment that I'm giving you until that rotting tissue is removed. This will be very painful, but there is no other way to get to the fungus that has caused Mr. Deibler's condition." Morning after morning, I sat on the end of the bed dressing Russell's feet. My unpleasant task was compounded by the strangeness I experienced in the presence of this wasted, spare man. Russell would laugh when I furtively looked up at him while I tended to his feet. It continued to tickle him that my garrulous nature had been bested. Dr. Jaffrey, his daughter Margaret, and I spent hours listening to the first-hand account of Russell's trek to the Whistle Lakes. After the first session, I came to wonder not at how much weight he had lost, but that he had survived at all. During the first 3 days of the trip, the carriers forged their way upstream, and Russell claimed that in all of his travels up and down Borneo's treacherous rivers, he had never felt as uneasy as he did with these inept oarsmen, who nearly capsized them in midstream. Russell had felt troubled when first introduced to the carriers. Now he knew that he should have trusted his intuition. They, like many of the New Guinea coastals, moved with lethargic, expressionless motions. Russell saw the effects of jungle life on the long-time coastal inhabitants, debilitated by dengue fever and repeated bouts of malaria where no quinine was available. When they arrived at Orawaha, expecting a crude base camp, they found nothing more than a large mat-rolled bamboo structure with a grass roof that barely provided a place out of the rain. His carriers were reduced to 7 by sickness. The 3 who were ill returned to Oeda with the canoe. After a hastily prepared meal, Russell and the remaining men divided the supplies among them, then adjusted their packs for the trail, anticipating an early start the following morning. Stretching out on the floor, the carriers were soon asleep. In the stillness that followed, Russell took from his pack his Bible and diary. Lighting a candle, he read, then recorded the events of the past 3 exhausting days. The trail was as hazardous as any of the explorers had described. All day, the lead carriers hacked away at the jungle undergrowth that obscured the crude trail. Each succeeding day carried them farther into the central highlands, with each mountain range higher than the last. They inched along narrow ledges jutting out over huge gorges cut by the Oeda River, rushing menacingly below, but serving as their guide to its source, the Whistle Lakes. The jungle-clad mountains begrudgingly gave way to ranges covered with broken bottle limestone outcroppings, often deceptively hidden under moss. The serrated shards cut through the leather shoes of Russell's field police boots. On New Year's Day, Russell awakened feeling completely depleted physically and concerned. His carriers were few, too few. Would the supplies last? Needing encouragement for the walk ahead into this unknown wilderness, He opened his Bible and came to a portion that seemed illumined on the page. Be strong and of a good courage. Be not afraid, neither be dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee whithersoever thou goest. Joshua 1:9. In his own immutable way, with this exhortation, God fortified Russell's soul for the desperate days ahead. Great care was exercised by those in the lead not to dislodge the stones and boulders precariously balanced beside the trail. A boulder set in motion could easily crush others on the switchbacks below. Climbing the almost perpendicular walls of the mountains, the men had to test the handholds, lest the stone be pried loose and hurled downward, injuring those beneath. The monsoon rains deluged them. Late afternoons they made camp. Already emaciated, Russell would drop his pack, then go back to help the carriers into camp. They made the minimum of repairs on the existing bivouacs, but the shelters still leaked. These bivouacs were low lean-tos constructed of saplings pounded into the ground and laced together with rattan between the four corner posts. Sapling doors were hung on hinges made of rattan. The roof was of grass or bark. The men's clothes were always wet. They huddled around the fire for warmth, apathetically eating their rice, dried peas, and salt fish. Picking up his diary, Russell began to read to us. This has been a grueling day. I forced myself to eat and boil water for drinking, but I had little appetite. All day I remained at the end of the line, endeavoring to keep the carriers in sight. From their furtive glances in my direction and whispered conversations during the rest stops, I feel convinced they planned to desert. After we made camp tonight, I prayed and reasoned with them that our only hope is to remain together, trusting God for strength to go on. That night was spent in prayer, pleading that God would keep the carriers from running away. In an early hour of the morning, Russell dropped into a troubled sleep. Noise of the carriers moving about the camp awakened him, and miracle of miracles, all were still with him. He could sympathize wholeheartedly with the men. 6 carriers had died on a former expedition over this trail. Every night the carriers, staggering under their loads, were helped into camp. Russell felt physically buffeted by the ever-increasing demands upon his fast-dwindling strength. This was not a large expedition with many police, sufficient carriers, and ample supplies. It was one man alone, exhausted, in an unfriendly jungle with 7 equally exhausted carriers. However, abandonment on this ill-defined trail, 1/3 of the way in and 2/3 of the way to his destination, meant certain death. Even though he was able to persuade his party to accompany him further by agreeing to leave a portion of his supplies, Russell knew it was possible he could awake some morning to discover that he had been forsaken during the night and that his supplies were gone. His only recourse was prayer. To the burden of the days fraught with hazard was added the agony of pleading by night for divine intervention and protection. He encouraged himself in the New Year's promise, "Be strong and of a good courage. The Lord thy God is with thee," and went on. Not a week later, Russell realized that it was imperative they retrieve the supplies left in the bivouac down trail, so he called a halt. He and some of the stronger men returned to bring the rest of their supplies forward by relay. After the change of pace and rest, the carriers were in a better frame of mind. As the men climbed higher, ever higher into the mountains, the days were warm, but the nights brought the added misery of a drastic drop in temperature. Russell and the men huddled together in their blankets around the fire, trying to take warmth from one another. They were coastal men, unaccustomed to the cold of the high altitudes. They suffered some weeping in the bitterness of believing that death hovered over them. There was no respite from the penetrating chill winds that shook their crude shelters and made a mockery of their fires. They came to dread seeing the sun sink behind the craggy ranges. There came that last dreadful day, the 18th day, a day of near total disaster that, by the goodness and mercy of God, ended at midnight in victory. They topped the 14th mountain range and emerged in Kapaku country. The terrain was comparatively flat, and a trail wound between sweet potato gardens. Sometimes the men toiled through mud up to their hips. But about 3 in the afternoon, the trail led to the river's edge, where they found canoes that were evidently used by government parties. They had not paddled far before they realized it would be suicide to go on. A storm upriver on Lake Pania caused high waves and dangerous currents where the lake, in its feverish thrust toward the coast and the sea, funneled out into the narrow, high-walled channel to become the Oedo River. 6 miserable hours they waited in the canoes for the wind and the waves to die down. By 9 o'clock all of them were shivering from the cold, and Russell felt he could wait no longer. Paddling against the current in the river warmed their blood. With grateful hearts they cheered when they swept out of the river channel into the larger body of water. They still had to cross the corner of the lake to reach Inaratali, the government post.